Montana Territory, September 1879. The rain came down in sheets, thick enough to blur the mountains and drown a horse's breath. And Barrett Vance had no business being out in it, except there was a woman screaming down by the flooded creek. He had been driving cattle along the ridge when the storm broke hard and fast. Thunder cracked like a rifle shot overhead, and the Blacktail River below surged over its banks, swallowing the lowlands in minutes. He had just turned his gelding around when he heard her. "Help!" The voice was raw, panicked, close. He spurred down fast, water ripping at the underbrush, and spotted her clinging to a half-submerged cottonwood. Her skirts tangled in the branches, her face pale with terror. She was no rancher's wife or saloon girl. Her dress was plain, not tattered, but soaked through. She looked young, maybe 20 or 21, with dark brown hair plastered to her face and both hands locked around the tree like it was the only thing keeping her alive. "I'm coming," Barrett shouted, his voice barely carrying over the flood. The river had broken through the bank, a wild surge of mud and ice-cold water. One wrong step and they would both be gone. He tied his horse to a stump above the waterline and yanked the rope from his saddle. He tested the knots with a wet palm, then wrapped it around his waist and tied the other end to the tree. "Do not let go," he told her as he reached her, fighting the pull of the current. "You hear me? I've got you." Her lips trembled, teeth chattering. I cannot, you can," he said, voice steady. "Look at me." She did. Wide brown eyes locked on his. "Good. Now hold tight." He got an arm around her waist and cut her free from the branches. The current slammed into them, but the rope held. Inch by inch, he dragged them back, boots slipping on the soaked ground until they collapsed onto the bank. Her breath hitched in her throat. She clutched his coat with both hands, shaking so hard he could feel it through the layers. "You're all right now," he said, pressing a calloused hand to her back. She did not answer, just buried her face against his chest. He waited until her breathing slowed before he said anything else. "What is your name, Clara?" she whispered. "Clara Bellamy." He peeled his coat off and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Barrett Vance. You got people nearby?" She shook her head. "I was on a stage out of Virginia City. It tipped when the bridge gave out. I do not know where the others are." Barrett glanced toward the water. Nothing but broken wood and debris. No driver, no horses, no other passengers in sight. His jaw tightened. "You are lucky to be alive." She nodded, eyes glassy, still in shock. "There's an old line shack a mile from here. Dry roof stove. We will head there." Clara opened her mouth like she might argue, then closed it again. She stood with his help, legs unsteady. He held her by the elbow, guiding her gently up the ridge. The shack was little more than 4 walls and a roof, but it was dry. Barrett lit the stove with flint and tinder while Clara sat on a crate wrapped in a blanket. Her hands were raw, scraped from the tree bark. He handed her a tin cup of coffee brewed over the flames. "Thank you," she said, voice quiet but clear. He pulled off his hat, raked a hand through damp hair, and sat across from her. "You need dry clothes. There's a trunk in the back. Might be something in there that fits." She nodded and disappeared behind the curtain. He heard her cough once, then nothing. When she returned, she wore an old flannel shirt and trousers tied at the waist. The clothes hung loose, but she looked warmer. Barrett stood. "You should rest." "I do not think I can sleep," she said. He hesitated. "You can take the cot." "I will stay by the fire." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right." When she lay down, she kept her eyes on him, like she needed to know he was still there. He sat cross-legged near the fire, watching the flames lick at the kettle. The rain slowed to a drizzle. "Thank you," she said again softly. "You already said that. I mean it." He looked over at her. "I know, she slept eventually." He did not. He watched the door, the windows, the dying fire. When dawn came, the storm had passed and the sky was clean and blue. By mid-morning, Clara was standing beside him outside the shack, arms folded against the chill. "I should go to Virginia City," she said. "I have family there. My uncle owns a print shop on South C Street. I can take you to the road," Barrett said. "But the stage will not be running for a few days. That river took the whole bridge." She looked up at him, hair loose around her shoulders. "Then I can help here. Until then," he raised an eyebrow. "Help? I am not useless," she said, chin lifting. "I can cook, so." "I know how to keep a fire going." Barrett studied her. She was pale, still tired, but there was steel under the surface. "All right," he said. "You can stay." She exhaled, a little smile tugging at her mouth. "Thank you." They spent the next 3 days in that shack. Clara cleaned, mended his torn shirts, and made something close to stew out of beans and salted beef. Barrett taught her how to split wood and set a snare line. She asked questions about the land, the cattle, the weather. He found himself talking more than he usually did, just to see her eyes light up. On the third night, as they sat by the fire again, she looked at him and said, "You saved me." Barrett looked into the flames. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," she said. "Not everyone would risk the river." He did not answer. She reached over and touched his hand. "You were kind when I was afraid." He looked at her then. Really looked. Her eyes were warm, steady. He had not realized how quiet his life had been until she filled it with her voice. "You are not just passing through, are you?" he asked. She smiled. "That depends." "On what?" "On if you want me to stay." Barrett's heart beat once hard. He had not expected those words, not from her, but when he looked at her he knew. "I do," he said. And Clara Bellamy, the woman he pulled from a flood, leaned in and kissed him like it was the most natural thing in the world. The morning after the rain broke, the valley turned gold under the sun. Mist lifted off the soaked grass, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine resin. Clara stood just outside the lined shack with her sleeves rolled up and her hair tied back in a kerchief, watching Barrett check the saddle cinch on his gelding. "When was the last time you saw your mother?" she asked, her tone easy but curious. Barrett didn't glance up. "Spring of '68. She lived in Council Bluffs then with my sister. Still does." He gave the horse a gentle pat along the neck. "Passed 2 winters later. Pneumonia." Clara's mouth tightened slightly, but she didn't offer sympathy. "You've ridden far from Iowa." "I wanted land of my own." Montana was empty enough for a man to disappear into. "You wanted to disappear." This time he looked up. "Didn't think I had much to offer anyone." Clara met his eyes. "You were wrong." He didn't answer, but the way his shoulders eased said enough. Later that day, Barrett rode into town with 2 hides bundled behind his saddle and Clara's letter to her uncle tucked inside his coat. It was a long ride down the switchback trails to the flatlands, and the river had carved new channels through the earth, cutting low bridges clean away. The general store was shuttered from flood damage, the post office dry but cluttered with crates and mud-tracked footprints. Barrett handed the letter to the clerk. "Make sure it gets to Virginia City." The clerk nodded without looking up. "Might be a week, maybe more." "Roads are poor." "She knows that," Barrett said. By the time he returned, dusk pressed low over the hills. Smoke curled from the shack's chimney, steady and thin. Inside, Clara knelt beside the stove, coaxing heat into a pan of cornmeal cakes. A second tin plate sat on the crate table, already laid out. "Did you find the road clear?" she asked, not turning. "Clear enough. Letters sent." "Thank you." She stood and wiped her hands on her skirt. "I boiled the last of the potatoes. There's still that flour you mentioned." He hung his hat on the peg and stepped inside. "You make it feel like more than it is." She smiled faintly. "I've lived with less." They ate in soft quiet, the fire snapping between them. Afterward, Barrett leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, watching the play of light on the wood floor. "My father used to read the Psalms aloud at night," Clara said suddenly. "Even when the roof leaked." Barrett tilted his head. "You believe in all that." "I think I believe in trying," she answered. "Even when there's no proof." He didn't reply right away. When he did, his voice was low. "I believe in what I can see, what I can hold." She studied him. "And what do you see now?" He looked at her across the space. "A woman who ought to be somewhere else, and yet here you are." "I'm not in a hurry," she said. A minute passed. Then another. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and melting snow. "You ever think about staying?" he asked. Clara didn't blink. "I've thought about it." "What holds you back?" She set her plate down slowly. "Nothing now." There wasn't any rush to what followed. Barrett stood, stepped close, and took her hand like he was learning the shape of it. She didn't pull away. Her fingers curled around his, warm and certain. She leaned her forehead against his chest. "You don't need to say anything." He nodded. "I wasn't planning to." They stood like that until the fire burned low, until the sky outside turned deep with stars. The next morning, Clara rose early and walked with Barrett to the fence line, where one of the younger calves had slipped the wire. She helped him mend it, steadying the post while he drove the staple in with rhythmic strikes. Her hands were blistered by the time they finished, but she didn't complain. "You could have let me do it alone," he said, wrapping the last length of wire. "I've never been good at watching from a distance," she answered. Before they walked back, she paused on the ridge, looking out over the valley. The river had settled, its waters dark and slow now, the violence of the flood a memory tucked beneath the surface. "Tell me something true," she said without looking at him. Barrett's voice was quiet behind her. "I used to think I didn't deserve peace." She turned to face him. "And now," he reached out and brushed a loose strand of hair from her cheek. "Now I'm not so sure." Her breath caught, but she didn't speak. She just nodded once, as if she understood something deeper than the words. That night, he gave her the spare key to the tack shed and let her sort the tools by lantern light while he fixed the window shutter that had blown loose. They worked side by side without speaking much, but the silence felt companionable, not empty. And when she brushed past him to hang the lantern, her shoulder touched his. Neither of them moved away. Clara looked up at him. "What if I don't send another letter?" Barrett didn't answer right away. He took the lantern from her hand and set it gently on the shelf. "Then I'd know you meant to stay," he said. She didn't move. "Would you want that?" His eyes didn't waver. "Yes." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind outside brushing the walls like a whisper. Then she reached up and kissed him, slow and deliberate, like she'd already made the choice. The first real frost came overnight, crisping the grass and silvering the eaves. Clara woke with her breath clouding in the air and Barrett already splitting logs out back, the swing of his axe steady, measured. She pulled on her boots, tucking her stockinged feet quickly inside, and stepped out with a wool shawl tight around her shoulders. "You always work before sunup?" she asked, voice still rough from sleep. Barrett paused mid-swing. "Don't see the sense in waiting for warmth that won't come till noon." Clara crouched near the stacked kindling, picked up a small branch and began breaking it down into splinters for the stove. "You ever think about building something more here? A proper house with a roof that doesn't leak and floors that don't creak every time you breathe?" He split another log clean through. "You offering to draw the plans?" "I might," she said, smiling into her scarf. He didn't answer, but he set the axe down and reached for the next log slower, like he was thinking about it now. Later that day, Clara found herself alone in the line shack while Barrett rode down to check on a neighbor's cattle. She scrubbed the wooden table with strong lye soap until the grain lightened under her hands and the scent of pine smoke faded. In the loft above, She searched through an old trunk he hadn't touched since she'd arrived: folded shirts, a tin shaving kit, a single yellowed letter addressed in a cramped hand. By the time he returned, dusk had fallen and she was seated by the fire, mending the underside of his saddlebag with one of his needles, thread looped between her fingers. He hung his coat beside the door, shaking off the cold. "You always fix things that aren't yours. If I'm using them, they might as well be," she said plainly. Barrett sat across from her and watched her tie off the thread. "What else did you find?" She held his gaze. "A letter from your brother from 4 years ago." He didn't move. "That trunk's been shut a long time, I noticed." Barrett reached toward the fire, palm open to the heat. "He wanted me to come back east, work in the lumber trade with him, said there'd be money in it." "Why didn't you go?" He looked at her then, quiet but sure. "Because I'd rather be poor out here than comfortable in the wrong life." Clara set the saddlebag aside. "You think this is the right life now? You're in it," he said. She stood and crossed to the stove, lifting the kettle. "I hope you don't mind, but I used the last of the rye flour. Made drop biscuits." He watched her pour the water. "Long as you stay, I don't mind much of anything." They ate by lamplight, the biscuits warm with honey she'd found in a sealed jar tucked high on a shelf. Afterward, Clara stood at the doorway, looking out over the dark land. The stars were low and bright, the kind of sky that made you feel small in the bones. "You ever miss being alone?" she asked, voice soft. Barrett rose slowly, setting his tin cup on the table. "Not once since that day on the river." She turned toward him. "I keep thinking about how fast it all changed. One moment I was drowning, and the next I was here." He stepped close enough that she could feel the warmth off him. "Sometimes it takes losing the ground under you to find where you're meant to be." Clara rested her hand against his chest, over the spot where his shirt curled with wear. "You don't talk much about what you want, not really." "I want peace that doesn't feel like giving up," he said. "And someone to wake up beside who doesn't look at me like I'm half a man for choosing this life." Her eyes didn't waver. "You've got both now." He cupped her cheek, rough thumb brushing along her jaw. "You sure about this?" "I was sure the minute I stopped running," she said. They didn't kiss right then. Instead, they stood together in the doorway, her head leaning against his shoulder, watching the wind ripple through the frost-bitten grass. The stove popped once, and the night deepened around them. In the weeks that followed, Clara stitched curtains from old flour sacks and hung them with bent nails. Barrett reinforced the roof with fresh shingles scavenged from a collapsed barn nearby. They worked side by side without ceremony. She planted onions in a patch of thawing soil, and he carved a cradle of all things, though neither of them spoke of why. One evening, after a long day repairing fence along the north ridge, Clara sat on the porch steps, boots unlaced, her hair braided tight against the chill. "I used to think I had to keep moving to stay ahead of the grief," she said, "but it always caught up." Barrett knelt beside her, untying the twine from a bundle of dry sagebrush. "It's slowed down any out here. It doesn't chase me so hard anymore." He set the bundle beside her and looked out at the horizon, where the sun bled into the hills. "Then maybe that's what healing is." Later that night, they shared the cot without question. Her hand found his beneath the blanket, fingers laced, steady. And when the wind rose again, the shack held strong. Barrett's hand hovered over the worn ledger that had sat untouched in the corner cabinet for years. The binding was cracked, the paper rough-edged from damp, but still legible. Clara had found it while sweeping behind the wood pile and left it on the table without a word. Now, days later, he opened it for the first time since his father's brand had been registered. He ran a finger down the list of calf counts and bartered tools, the looping script steady and plain. His father's handwriting. He remembered helping with those numbers long before the war, before the land belonged to him alone. Clara stepped in from outside, her skirt hem damp from the snowmelt that still clung to the shaded parts of the land. She unwrapped her shawl slowly, eyes catching on the ledger. "You kept it," she said, not as a question. "I never threw it out," Barrett answered. She pulled off her gloves and laid them flat on the stove's ledge. "There's something good in knowing where a place started." He nodded, then closed the book gently. "I thought I'd let it all go a long time ago. But you didn't." "No," he said. "I didn't." She crossed to the basin and poured water from the kettle, letting the steam rise over her hands. "My father kept a drawer full of things he never spoke about. Letters from his brother in Tennessee, a photograph of a woman that wasn't my mother. I only saw them once, when we packed the house after he died." Barrett looked at her. "You ever wonder what he was holding back?" "Not anymore," she said. "There's peace in leaving some questions unanswered." The wind outside shifted, not sharp but steady, like the land was settling into the early thaw. Barrett stepped to the door, his boots heavy on the floorboards, and opened it to the pale afternoon sun. He watched the yard, the shallow dip where the creek had receded, the fence line that curved into the tree line. Then he spoke without turning. "I've been thinking of buying the next acreage over, the one with the hollow that draws elk in winter." Clara dried her hands, folded the cloth neatly. "You planning to run more head, maybe, or plant barley? Soil's fair and it holds water." She stepped beside him, her shoulder brushing his. "You're building out." "I'm thinking past winter for the first time in a while." Her smile reached her eyes. "That sounds like a life." He turned to her, the light catching in the lines beside his mouth. "It's not just mine anymore." She didn't answer, just leaned into him, her hand resting lightly against his back, like she'd always belonged there. Later, Barrett rode out to the neighboring land. The air had that early spring bite, sharp but not cruel, and the ground was soft under the horses' hooves. When he returned, Clara was standing near the corral, watching a hawk circle far above the ridge. "The man's willing to sell," he said, hitching the reins. She turned. "And you want it." "I want what it would give us." That night, they moved the cot closer to the stove without speaking of it. Barrett rolled out a fresh blanket, thicker than the others, and Clara tucked her braid beneath the pillow. They lay side by side, the silence warm and easy. "Did you ever think you'd build a future with someone?" she asked softly, her back to him. "No," he answered. "But I'm glad I was wrong." She reached back, found his hand, and held it steady. "Me too." Morning came with a thin crust of frost that would be gone by midday. Barrett rose first, lit the stove, and poured water into the coffee pot. Clara stirred as the scent reached her, then sat up, rubbing her eyes. She pulled on her shawl and joined him at the table. "I had a dream last night," she murmured, wrapping her hands around the warm tin cup. "What about a house?" she said, "with a porch that faced west and a rocking chair that creaked just enough to sound like home." He sipped his coffee, watching her over the rim. "We could build that." "I think we already are," she said. The day unfolded quiet and full. Clara gathered dried herbs from a patch she'd started near the north wall. Barrett rode fence again, hammering in loose nails and retying wire where the winter had tugged it free. When he came back, the smell of stewed rabbit rose through the air, and Clara was reading a worn volume of Emerson by the fire, legs tucked beneath her. He sat beside her and took her hand. She looked up, her expression unreadable for a moment. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "A wedding," she said. "Small, just us and the land." Barrett's grip tightened around her fingers. "You sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." He nodded once, and there was something in his chest that eased like a rope finally untied. "I'll carve a ring," he said. She leaned forward, her forehead touching his. "You already gave me more than I ever thought I'd have." The fire crackled low, and the wind outside had softened. They sat there, close and quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't need filling. The kind that meant something had rooted deep and would hold through whatever came next. Spring unfurled slow and steady across the hills, and by late April the land had softened under the thaw. The creek, once wild with flood, now ran clear and even. Grass pushed up through ash-colored soil, and the world smelled of wet bark and new beginnings. Barrett stood on the rise above the house site, measuring the slope with his eyes. He hadn't drawn up plans, not on paper, but the frame lived sharp and full in his head. He could see the porch Clara had described, the way the west light would pour through the windows come evening. He could see her there too, arms dusted with flour, eyes bright from some small thing she'd noticed in the day. He heard her boots crunching over gravel before he saw her. She came to stand beside him, her hair pinned back with a carved comb, the one he'd shaped from juniper wood and tucked into her sewing basket without a word. "I walked the boundary again," she said. "There's a stand of elm in the north corner. Would be good for shade if you grazed the horses there." He nodded. "I'll run a post line to keep them from the garden patch." She tilted her face toward the sun. "Do we still have that tin of nails from the shed near the creek? Used half of it on the stall gate," he said. "But there's enough left for the first beams." Clara turned to him then, brows lifted. "Then let's raise a frame." They worked through the week, Barrett cutting lengths of pine with his saw and square, Clara sorting bolts and oiling the hinges they'd traded for in town. She learned the feel of the lumber, its rough grain and knots, and he watched her with quiet pride when she steadied a crossbeam while he drove it into place. One morning, as they leveled the foundation, she paused and looked toward the hills. "My uncle sent word," she said. "The shop sold. He's moving to Helena." Barrett straightened from his crouch. "You all right with that?" She nodded slowly. "I think he was always waiting for a reason to stop printing obituaries." Barrett tossed the level onto the earth beside them. "You think he'll ever come out here?" "I doubt it," she said, then smiled. "But he sent a wedding gift, a cast iron stove." Barrett chuckled, low and surprised. "That's no small thing." "It's his way of saying he approves," she said. Without saying it. By mid-May, the frame stood tall against the blue sky, rafters set and walls roughed in with boards from a mill upriver. Barrett's hands were thick with calluses, and Clara's knuckles bore scrapes from hauling lumber, but neither of them seemed to mind. On the last day of framing, she brought out a small pouch stitched with her initials and handed it to him. "What's this?" he asked. "Open it." Inside lay a ribbon, deep green and soft, bound around a folded square of linen. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a scrap of parchment with a single passage from Scripture in Clara's tidy script, "Let the wilderness and its towns raise their voice." Barrett turned the linen over, felt its weight. "To hang in the house," she said. "Somewhere near the door." He held her gaze. "It'll be the first thing folks see when they walk in." They married on the first Sunday in June, beneath the cottonwoods just east of the house site. There was no preacher, just the two of them and the land that had bound their lives together. Barrett carved 2 plain rings from the same length of cherry wood, sealed with beeswax and worn smooth by his thumb. They spoke their vows quietly, without grandeur, but with a steadiness that made the moment feel holy. Clara's hand never trembled in his. When she said his name, it caught the breeze like a promise. That night they slept in the unfinished house, the roof overhead and the wind gentle against the walls. Barrett lay beside her on the pallet, one arm beneath her head, the other wrapped around her waist. She pressed her forehead to his chest and said nothing at all, and he knew she didn't need to. 2 years later, the barley field ran green and full along the southern slope, and the porch Clara dreamed of stood wide and sturdy, its boards worn smooth beneath her bare feet. The cast-iron stove had pride of place in the kitchen, and the linen scrap hung near the door, framed in pine, right where Barrett said it would be. Their son had Barrett's dark hair and Clara's eyes, and he toddled between them with a wooden spoon he refused to let go of, even in sleep. Clara rocked him on the porch in the evening, humming a tune her mother once sang while Barrett sharpened tools at the workbench just inside. Neighbors came by sometimes. A widow from the next ridge, two brothers who raised sheep west of the tree line, even the man who sold them the land. They brought preserves, stories, and news from town. They stayed because the house felt lived in, not perfect, but right. Barrett leaned against the doorway one night, watching Clara tuck their boy beneath a quilt stitched from old shirts and feed sacks. She turned, caught his gaze, and crossed the room to him. "I thought I'd lost this kind of peace for good," she whispered. He brushed a hand along her cheek. "Turns out it was waiting out here." They stepped outside together, the sky wide above and the air thick with the scent of wild sage. He reached for her hand, and she curled her fingers into his without hesitation. "You regret any of it?" she asked quietly. He looked out over the land they'd built, the life they'd made. "Not a single thing," he said. And they stayed there long after the stars came out, wrapped in the quiet of a life fully chosen, with nothing left behind that hadn't already been healed.